name is Dr. Dana Wasserman, and this is Tough Talk with Dr. Dana. Today's Tough Talk is about psychosis in the time of COVID-19. But first, please read the disclaimer and please listen to these important words. I'm legally required to tell you that I'm not providing psychological services and that this isn't intended to treat, diagnose, or cure any psychological issues you may have. I will be sure to honor your questions so that if necessary, you will know better when to seek help. Thank you. So today we're going to discuss psychosis. Now, let me be clear. Psychosis in and of itself is not a mental illness or a psychological disorder. Rather, it is a set of symptoms that are part and parcel to a number of mental illnesses, such as schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, in which psychosis can occur during either manic or depressive episodes, or major depressive disorder, in which psychosis can be a modifier or additional symptom, but this is much less common. In addition, there is a spectrum of psychotic disorders that are vast and are outside of our scope today, but I'll mention them nonetheless. For example, there's the well-known schizophrenia, but there is also schizoaffective disorder, which also has a mood component, schizophreniform disorder, delusional disorder, and brief psychotic disorder. They differ in terms of the duration of symptoms and whether or not there is an intersection of psychosis and mood symptoms, for example. However, the one common thread is in fact psychosis. So let's talk about what exactly psychosis is. Psychosis is a break with reality. Sums it up right there. So what does that actually mean? This means that how we perceive what is real is in fact not real. Approximately 3% of people will experience psychosis in their lifetime. Psychosis affects men and women equally, and psychosis occurs across all cultures and all socioeconomic groups. Psychosis usually first appears in the late teens or early 20s. And in fact, you'll find that many mental illnesses will begin to manifest in the late teens and early 20s. So a common question I get is, how do people develop psychosis? Well, there have been found to be 6 primary factors that can precipitate a psychotic break if one is so predisposed. Now, how is one predisposed? People are predisposed towards mental illness through genetics and environment. So that is, let's say if I have the genetics for mental illness, it might take some environmental triggers to serve as a catalyst to start off, say, a mental illness. And it is the same too for psychosis. And they are your life situation, physical state, thoughts, perceptions, emotions, and actions. In addition, these factors can all interact with one another. For example, a certain action, say being fired from a job, can interact with a series of emotions, anger, fear, panic, that for some can precipitate a psychosis. Getting fired from a job is a true stressor. So let me give you some other stressors that are found to be precipitants of psychosis. The death of a loved one, losing money, moving to a new city or country, people not treating you well, or losing your job or taking a new job. Now, if you notice, for something like moving to a new city or country or taking a new job, these might be seen as, hey, these are positive. Why would they be precipitants of psychosis? Simply because something is positive does not mean it's without stress. So we all know how stressful moving is. It might be for a fantastic reason and it might be really exciting, but it's also incredibly stressful. And that can be enough of a precipitant for a psychotic break. Now, let's talk about what makes up psychosis. Psychosis is manifest primarily by delusions and hallucinations, and I'm sure most of you have heard of these before, but let's explain them more in depth. Delusions are fixed beliefs that do not change in spite of evidence to the contrary. In other words, they are beliefs that do not bear truth in reality as we know it. but they cannot be changed. There are some common themes of delusions that we see. And the first one is persecutory. Persecutory delusions are false beliefs that one is going to be harmed by a person or a group, and these are by far the most common. And when I worked with clients with psychosis, these were by far the most common. There are referential delusions, and this is the false belief that specific gestures, comments, or environmental hints are directed at the person. So, for example, if I'm walking down the street and there is a couple having a conversation, and the woman in the couple says something like, oh, something about a dress, I might immediately think she's talking about me and my dress, and that might be incredibly upsetting. That is a referential delusion. Grandiose delusions are false beliefs that he or she has exceptional abilities, wealth, or fame. Erotomanic delusions are the false beliefs that another is in love with the other person. And I know that we've heard about this in possible stalking cases where one person is convinced that the other is in love with them, or that the person sees someone on TV and that person becomes convinced that that person on TV is in love with him or her. Nihilistic delusions are the false beliefs that a major catastrophe will occur. And somatic delusions are false preoccupations regarding health and body. That is, that one might believe that some certain organ is dying and there's nothing that can convince that person otherwise, even though all medical tests prove otherwise. That person is still convinced that this particular organ is dying. Now, delusions are also separated by being bizarre and non-bizarre. Delusions are deemed bizarre when they're clearly impossible, and I'll give you an example. For example, if I were to tell you that aliens from another galaxy have taken over my brain, this would be called a bizarre delusion because we know that this cannot happen. Indeed, delusions in which there is a loss of control over the mind and or body are considered bizarre. And there are a couple examples of this I want to share with you. There is thought withdrawal, thoughts that have been hijacked or taken away by an outside force. Then there is thought insertion, and that's as it sounds, that thoughts, outside thoughts, have been inserted into one's mind. And delusions of control, that your body or actions are controlled by an outside force. These are all considered bizarre delusions. What would now be considered a non-bizarre delusion? Non-bizarre delusions are those that could ostensibly happen, but are still near impossible, such as one fears that he or she is being surveilled by the FBI when no crimes have been committed. Now, people have been surveilled by the FBI. This is true. It is a possibility. But if we know someone who has committed no crimes whatsoever, and if he or she is now convinced that the FBI is trailing them, then there's something else to be concerned about. That would be considered a non-bizarre delusion. Now we're going to talk about hallucinations, and I know most of us have heard of hallucinations before. Hallucinations are perceptions that are experienced without an external stimulus. In other words, hallucinations are the experience of hearing or seeing things that are not truly there. In fact, they can occur with any of the senses, with your olfactory sense, your gustatory sense, that's your taste. But the most common are auditory hallucinations, hearing things that are not there. And again, working with this population of clients, I also found this anecdotally to be true. Typically, auditory hallucinations are typically found in the form of voices, either one's own voice or in a different voice. And importantly, these voices are described as fully separate from one's person, not simply the voice of one's own thoughts. Think about it. When we think to ourselves, we hear a voice, and it's our own voice. But as has been described to me, it is as though the voices are disembodied, and they are coming from without, and they are speaking to the person rather than coming from within the person. One important aspect when looking at delusions and hallucinations is the cultural aspect. That is, what may seem delusional in one culture, such as beliefs in witchcraft, may be part and parcel to a different culture. So this must be taken into consideration when looking at this. In addition, some cultures, hearing God's voice is not considered a hallucination, but rather something that is patently normal. And again, we must be mindful of this. Another aspect of psychosis is disordered thinking and speech. There are ways in which how one expresses him or herself that can be considered psychotic. For example, zipping one from one topic to another that have no connection. Those are called loose associations. And that's a symptom. Tangential thinking is exhibited by answering a question in such a way that it is completely derailed from the question itself. In other words, the answer to a question has little to do with the question at all. I mean, we might know people who are tangential, but in terms of psychosis, that the answer is so far removed from the question that there is absolutely zero relationship between one and the other. And a rarer instance is linguistic incoherence, or what we call word salad. And these are thoughts that are expressed that make zero sense or nearly comprehensible. And I did have a number of clients who did produce word salad, and it made therapy really interesting. So let's talk more about psychosis, because there's more. Psychosis can also manifest what are called negative symptoms. These are the most common in schizophrenia, but these can also be presented in other psychotic disorders. The two most common are diminished emotional expression and avolition. The latter is better understood, meaning lacking in motivation. Avolition, lacking volition, motivation. Diminished emotional expression includes a lack of facial expression, so you're flat-faced, a lack of prosody, and prosody is vocal intonations. So when we talk, we usually have a fluctuation. We go up as we talk and we go down, and it's flat with these negative symptoms. And a lack of gesticulations that people typically generate to punctuate speech. So, even though I'm sitting here behind the computer, I am gesturing. If I were psychotic and had this particular negative symptom, my hands would just be at my sides, probably slack. With avolition, there is a lack of motivation to engage in meaningful activities, whether it be work, social, or even self-care. People who live with psychosis may also have trouble filtering out extraneous stimuli. That is, stuff that we can usually ignore, such as the sounds of cars whizzing by or the light emanating from a stoplight, might be hard to block out, and the whole world might then begin to feel overwhelming. So that leads me to, how can we best support someone with psychosis? It is important that we try to see the world through the eyes of one who lives with psychosis. There is no need to try to challenge their perceptions, because that would be akin to someone else challenging your perceptions of reality. Remember, the one living with psychosis has fixed beliefs and faulty perceptions, and this is their truth. This is how they exist in the world. When I worked with this population, I always listened for themes that seemed to surface as something akin to, quote, a real experience. And I would grab onto that. Still, there are concrete things you can do to support your loved one living with psychosis. For example, be gentle and calm, first and foremost. Make them feel comfortable to share what is going on in their life. Don't focus on the content of their delusions and hallucinations. Focus on what is troubling them. Empathize with their situation instead of criticizing and correcting their misperceptions. Focus on their feelings and what they say, not the actual facts of the story. Ask them if you can help in any way. Ask them about things you know they enjoy. Emphasize strengths. Share love in a way that they can tolerate. And this may simply be giving your full attention to their thoughts. Don't underestimate the power of human connection, and that goes for everybody. Contact their treatment team if you feel like there's an issue with safety with him or her, and that's really important too. Now, let's talk about psychosis and COVID-19. As I've discussed in previous episodes, dealing with the psychological fallout from COVID-19 can be quite significant, and it takes some real forethought to take care of oneself during this time of physical distancing, isolation, and coping with the knowledge we are in the midst of a pandemic. Now, for those who live with psychosis in any one of the disorders I've listed above, their efforts may seem to be greater, as typically they are more susceptible to the sequelae of stressors. Therefore, it's really quite important that those who live with psychosis do their best to do the following in order to preserve their optimal well-being. Try to stay with your treatment plan. Whatever your treatment plan was before COVID-19, stick with it now. Only make changes in conjunction with your provider who can assist you with strategies how to keep your routine in line. Next, practice healthy coping skills. As I've mentioned before, people living with psychosis can be extra sensitive to stress, and it can be very disruptive. Having healthy coping mechanisms such as mindfulness, going for walks with appropriate physical distancing, and mellow activities such as drawing and painting can help counteract the stress of the pandemic and the changes inherent within it. Try to stay in touch and avoid too much isolation. I've mentioned this as well in a number of previous episodes, the importance of staying socially connected while we're physically distanced. In particular, for those who live with psychosis, isolation is especially unhealthy, as it becomes more likely the person could fall deeper and deeper into his or her own thoughts. Whether it is by Zoom, FaceTime, simply knowing someone cares enough to interact with you is incredibly healing. I cannot stress the importance of this enough. Thank you so much. And that concludes my talk on psychosis. I see I have a couple questions here as we're actually wrapping up on time. Let's see. Do life situation triggers have to be extreme, or can they also be mild? I believe they can be mild. It depends on how primed or how predisposed the person is to psychosis. If that person is already teeming, ready for a psychotic break, it might just take a mild environmental stressor to tip that person over the edge into psychosis. Once the environment triggers psychosis, can it be stopped if caught early? I always say that if something can be caught early, it can be helped early. So from what I've seen, from what I've worked with, if I worked with someone who, say, had a real stressful event and that seemed to be on the edge of another psychotic break, if we were to get the person the proper therapy and medication, it would sometimes put that psychotic break aside and the person could function fairly well. I won't say that happened all the time, but it happened time and time again during my work. And I worked with the chronically and severely mentally ill of the San Francisco Tenderloin neighborhood about 15 years ago. And I learned so much about psychosis and how people live and even thrive within that, as difficult as it is, because medication is not perfect and therapy is not perfect. And so people still struggle mightily to stay within reality. And interestingly enough, another piece of psychosis that was best described to me by one of my clients was that it feels like, imagine having a nightmare and imagine walking through that nightmare during the day while you're awake. That same kind of wobbliness where you know you're there, but you don't feel really like you're there, and everything is terrifying. I thought was a really apt way to describe what it was like to have a psychotic break. And let me see if there are any more questions here. Can psychosis be treated by medication? Before I answer this, I always like to give the disclaimer here that I am not a psychiatrist. I do not dispense medications. I do not give advice on medications. But what I did when I worked with this particular population was that I worked very closely with the staff psychiatrist who did dispense medications to help with psychosis. And there are many medications which are called antipsychotics, which are specifically for that purpose. Let's see. How can we reduce the stigma of psychosis other than talking about it? It seems to be something difficult for someone who has never experienced mental illness to understand. This is precisely one of the reasons. Actually, I'm going to read that again out loud. How can we reduce the stigma of psychosis other than talking about it? It seems to be something difficult for someone who has never experienced mental illness to understand. One of the reasons why I am giving this talk is to give some light into what it is like to have psychosis and to actually help reduce the stigma, because it is such a shamed psychological issue. This one in particular, the way it has been portrayed in the media, the way it has been portrayed in the movies, the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, and I know I'm dating myself here because that was back in 1975, okay, is a brilliant, brilliant movie and absolutely humanized people who were psychotic. But there's also issue in other movies for how they were portrayed as someone to make fun of or someone to be horrified by. And this probably dates its way back through history with insane asylums and whatnot. So I might be going off topic a little bit here, but my point is that I think if we keep talking about it and we keep bringing it up and not keeping it quiet, and I think keeping it quiet exacerbates its shame and stigma, I think we'll be able to make some impact in the world of psychosis. And so people who do have psychosis can speak up themselves. I do not have any symptoms of psychosis with bipolar 2. That was not one of my symptoms, so I cannot speak to that. But I can only hope to be an ally and leave the words to them to describe their experiences and what they have gone through. Okay. Well, it looks like we are out of questions. And it looks like we are out of time. So I want to thank you so much for watching and listening today. This has been a really fascinating topic that I've enjoyed immensely, and some great questions too. So I look forward to seeing you next week at the same time. And my name is Dr. Dana Wasserman, and this is Tough Talk with Dr. Dana. Take care.